Thank you, Claire, and good evening, everybody. Half of all the women here will get osteoporosis over the age of 50. 1 in 5 of you men will. When that happens, if you fall, you will break your bones. You may need a hip replacement, and unfortunately, 1 in 4 of those of you that have had a fracture will die within a year because your mobility will be so seriously compromised, will seriously compromise your health. Biologists have been studying osteoporosis for years, and amazingly, it's still very difficult to diagnose the disease before a person gets a fracture. Even if they do, the drug treatments available, like hormone therapy, only prevent fractures in about half of the sufferers. So why is this? Well, doctors and biologists have studied the cell and molecular changes in the bone, and they've designed drug treatments that target the symptom of osteoporosis, which is bone loss. But it still remains that the exact cause of osteoporosis is not known. When I was young, I was really interested in things like osteoporosis, things to do with the body. But I had no interest in treating any patients. And even though I didn't care about cars or planes or bridges, I was good at maths and physics, so I decided to study engineering and not medicine. Luckily enough for me, I dodged the yellow hard hat and found my way into biomedical engineering. Engineers are problem solvers, and a biomedical engineer is a problem solver for the body. The body is a fascinating machine. The most obvious example of this is the heart, which is a powerful pump for blood. But our bones are also amazing engineering materials. They're phenomenally strong, but lightweight. And this allows us to walk around every day with very little effort. And this strength comes from their internal architecture. And this architecture fascinated a famous surgeon in the 1800s, a guy called Julius Wolff, when he noticed that the architecture of bones was very similar to that of a crane. You may have noticed that the tennis player Serena Williams has one really big arm. If you haven't noticed this, Google it. It's amazing. And most people would think this is because the muscles in our tennis playing arm are bigger. And they are, of course. But actually, her bones are much bigger and they're stronger. And this is all happening because cells in our body can change the design of the tissues to respond to the physical activities we put them through. So, take the NASA astronaut as another example. After 6 months on an international space station, the astronauts have bones that are as weak as those of old women with osteoporosis. And we all know that astronauts don't really weigh anything in space. So the problem is that the cells aren't stretched or pulled like they would be when we walk around on our bones every day. So the cells then think that they don't need this bone anymore, and they begin to eat away at it. So there's a clear link between the mechanical forces that we put on our bones through activity and bone strength. So osteoporosis then is fundamentally an engineering problem of a design that's malfunctioning. The cells are not keeping the structure strong enough for the physical activities we put them under. And then eventually the bone breaks. So it's just like a suspension bridge that's past its lifetime, which is why I think that an engineering approach might be a better way to solve this particular problem. There's a distinct difference between the mindset of an engineer and a biologist. And Albert Einstein put it this way: scientists investigate that which already is. Engineers create that which never has been. My research group is using a combination of engineering and biology to study the design of bones by treating them like engineering structures. We apply physics, maths, and computer models to compare the forces on cells from healthy bones to those of osteoporotic bones. We also use, much the same as a civil engineer compares the design of two bridges, by using models to compare how they'd perform under different stresses. We also use biology to identify tiny proteins in the body that act as force sensors. And we design ways of driving fluid over our cells, and then we can study the biology of how those cells respond to the force that's being put on them. We have, of course, had some failures along the way, possibly because we're engineers. We once spent 6 months repeating the same experiment over and over because our cells kept floating away. We couldn't understand it. We broke the problem down like engineers. We took apart our chambers, checked every part, double-checked the flow velocities. And we eventually found out that all we needed to do was put our cells upside down. So, unlike machines or computers, cells are not predictable. And they do their own thing, which is a little bit like my husband. But in both cases, I learned that if you spend time trying to get to know them, you can eventually manipulate them to do what you want. Another challenge for an engineer working in this field is funding. Once when I applied for funding, I was told to stick to computer models. But luckily enough for me, the European Research Council funds blue sky research. And they took a punt on me to the tune of 1.5 million. And this allowed me to assemble a team of 12 engineers and biologists. Our studies are driving a change in the understanding of osteoporosis. And what we're finding out is that these cells have very different force sensors. And when you put fluid over them and put forces on them, they respond very differently in bone tissue from osteoporotic patients. So this research is opening up potential new targets for drug treatment, specifically ones that might block that sensor or turn off that biological signal. One of the most exciting things that we do is we try to grow new bone in the lab. And biologists have been trying to grow bone in the lab for quite a while, but what they're producing is something that's very jelly-like, and you wouldn't be able to walk around on it. So we're taking a different approach. We're trying to grow these cells in an environment that replicates the forces that are on them in the body. And we're drawing from our computer models to do this. So far, we've been able to grow tiny pieces of bone that have a lot of mineral in them. And mineral is the substance that makes our bone strong. We don't know quite yet whether this bone is going to be good enough to be put into a large defect or a large fracture or into the bones of a rugby player, for example. But we're still working on it. But luckily enough, I have time and energy on my side, and I'm going to keep pursuing this research question. And maybe in a few years' time, if I'm successful, you might see an engineer instead of a doctor to first get a computer diagnosis and then get some new bone grown and implanted as a treatment. So thank you for listening.